The late afternoon sun had a cruel way of turning the dry earth into something alive, something that breathed heat into your skin until it felt like your very blood was boiling. The settlement's main road was nothing more than a strip of hard-packed dust, cracked like the skin of an old farmer's hands. On that road, people had gathered. Men in worn hats and dust-stained coats, women in faded bonnets, children clutching at their mothers' skirts, all of them standing in a tight circle. The center of that circle was Lila. 19 years old, though life in this place had carved lines into her face that made her seem older. Her eyes were a soft brown, but in that moment they were wide with terror, fixed on the wooden stakes hammered into the ground around her. She was barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, dust clinging to her knees. The preacher's voice rang out over the murmuring crowd, sharp as the crack of a whip. "She's been touched by the curse," he declared, holding his Bible high. "She's barren, and the Lord's punishment is clear. A woman who cannot bear fruit will bring famine to the land, sickness to the young, and ruin to the men who take her to wife." The words were salt in wounds Lila had been trying to keep hidden for months. She could still feel the echo of her husband's voice from the night before. "I can't keep you if you can't give me children." There had been no softness in him, no hesitation. His family had pushed for it, whispering that he deserved better, that their bloodline must continue. Now here she was, condemned not for a crime she had committed, but for the life her body could not give. Two men, the blacksmith's sons, stepped forward with shovels. The ground had already been loosened by earlier digging, a shallow pit carved into the baked earth. The crowd stepped back just enough to give the men room. Lila's breath came in short bursts. She tried to step away, but rough hands grabbed her arms. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, the fibers cutting into her skin. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse. "Please, I didn't do anything." A woman in the crowd, someone Lila had once brought soup to when she was sick, spat on the ground. "You brought bad luck to this place. That's enough." The preacher gave a solemn nod. "This is mercy," he said. "We bury her up to the neck. By sunrise tomorrow, if the Lord wills, she be gone and her curse lifted from our land." The blacksmith's sons shoved her forward. Her knees hit the edge of the pit, the shock sending a jolt of pain up her legs. They forced her down into the hole, the loose dirt cold at first against her skin but quickly warming under the relentless sun. She could smell the dry, bitter scent of the soil mixed with her own sweat. They filled the hole quickly. Shovel after shovel, the earth rose around her legs, her hips, her waist. Each layer of dirt pressed heavier against her ribs, making it harder to breathe. The crowd's voices blurred together into a dull roar in her ears. She felt the first real spark of panic when the dirt reached her chest. She tried to move her arms, to push the soil away, but it was already too heavy. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. By the time the dirt reached her shoulders, the world around her felt distant, as if she were already halfway buried in another world. A child in the crowd giggled, and the sound sliced through her like a blade. Finally, only her neck and head remained above the ground. Her hair clung in damp strands to her face, the sun scorching her scalp. She turned her head as much as she could, scanning the faces around her. No one met her gaze. The preacher stepped forward one last time. "The Lord sees all," he said, voice low but carrying. "By tomorrow her spirit will be judged." The crowd began to disperse, boots crunching in the dirt, voices fading. A few lingered to throw small stones near her, not to harm, but to remind her she was alone. When the last of them left, silence fell. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on you from all sides, heavy and unmoving. Only the low whistle of the wind passed over the land, lifting the edges of her torn dress and carrying with it the faint smell of mesquite from somewhere far away. Her throat was already dry. The sun's weight on her skin was relentless. Somewhere above, a vulture circled lazily, its shadow gliding over the ground like a warning. Leela closed her eyes. She told herself she would not cry, that she wouldn't give them the satisfaction even if they weren't there to see. But the tears came anyway, hot and fast, tracing lines through the dust on her cheeks. Her mind wandered to the home she had once dreamed of. A little cabin with a garden, the sound of a baby's laughter. She had clung to that dream even when the doctor had told her, with quiet pity in his eyes, that her womb would never carry life. Now the dream was gone. Her lips moved in a whisper, a prayer not for rescue but for the strength to endure. The earth around her felt tighter with every breath, as if it wanted to claim her already. The sun began to sink, but the heat didn't leave. And Lila, buried up to her neck in the endless desert, waited for the night and whatever came with it. The desert had a way of swallowing sound. Out there, beyond the scattered clapboard houses of the settlement, there was only the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, and the creak of saddle leather. Ethan Cole rode alone. His hat brim shaded his eyes, but the lines on his face spoke of years under sun and hardship. His horse, a tall buckskin gelding named Jasper, carried him steady as they made their way back from the cattle market 2 towns over. The day had been long, the deals longer, and his thoughts were already drifting to the small ranch waiting for him and the 4 children who depended on him. He wasn't in the mood for detours. But the desert had a way of deciding for a man when his day was over. At first, it was nothing more than a faint sound carried on the wind, something too weak to be the cry of an animal, too sharp to be the whistle of air through rock. Ethan slowed Jasper and tilted his head. There it was again, faint, broken, like a voice that had been worn to shreds. Help. Please. Ethan's hand tightened on the reins. He scanned the horizon. Out here, sound could play tricks on you, bounce off ridges, fade without warning, but something in his gut told him this was no trick. He turned Jasper toward the sound. The sun was still fierce, though it was slipping lower, painting the desert in a wash of gold and rust. Every hoof step sent up little clouds of dust, the air shimmering with heat. Ethan kept listening, narrowing in on the direction, until the sound grew clearer, still faint, but real. Then he saw a dot. At first, he thought it might be a rock. But as Jasper drew closer, the rock took on the unmistakable shape of a human head. The rest of the body was gone from sight, swallowed by the earth. A woman. Her face was blistered from the sun, lips cracked and bleeding. Dust clung to her hair, and her eyes, half closed, fluttered at the sound of hooves. Ethan was off his horse in a heartbeat. He dropped the reins and knelt beside her, the shadow of his body falling over her face. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice meant to keep panic away. Her gaze shifted to him. For a moment, it was like she couldn't quite believe he was real. Then her lips moved. "Please, get me out." It didn't matter to him who she was or why she'd been left this way. No one deserved to die like that. He grabbed the small spade from his saddlebag and began digging. The dirt was packed firm in places, loose in others, but it came away quick under his hands. He worked fast, sweat running down his temples, the sun burning into his neck. "You're gonna be all right," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. With every scoop, more of her body was freed, her shoulders, her arms, her waist. He cut the rope at her wrists with his knife, the coarse fibers falling away. She let out a shuddering breath as the pressure eased. "Who did this to you?" he asked, but she didn't answer. Her eyes had closed again, though her chest still rose and fell in shallow breaths. When her legs were free, he slid his arms under her and lifted her clear of the pit. She was light, too light, the kind of light that came from days without food or water. Jasper snorted as Ethan carried her back to the horse. He swung into the saddle with her cradled against him, her head resting weakly against his chest. The desert stretched out ahead, miles of dust and heat between them and the safety of his ranch. But Ethan didn't hesitate. "Hang on," he said. Softly, nudging Jasper into a steady lope, the wind rose behind them, scattering the loose dirt around the empty hole as if erasing the scene altogether. For Lila, the world faded into the steady rhythm of hooves and the sound of a heartbeat she didn't yet realize belonged to the man who had just changed her fate. The ranch came into view just as the sun sank low, the horizon burning in shades of amber and deep crimson. The main house stood sturdy against the wind, its wooden siding weathered but well kept. A barn sat a little ways off, the fences around. It straight and strong, and beyond, the open pasture rolled out toward the distant hills. Ethan Cole rode in slow, careful not to jostle the girl in his arms. She hadn't spoken since the rescue. Her eyes had fluttered open once or twice, only to close again, her head lolling against his chest. As they crossed the yard, the sound of the front door opening broke the evening quiet. A girl of about 14 stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hair was pulled back tight, the same shade of chestnut brown as Ethan's. "Pa?" she called, her voice holding a note of surprise. "Who's that?" Ethan dismounted, still holding Lila. "Clara, fetch some water, and tell your brothers to keep back for now." Clara's eyes flicked to the stranger in her father's arms, her brow furrowing. "Where'd she come from?" "Just do as I said," Ethan replied, his tone gentle but firm. Clara hesitated for half a second, then turned and vanished inside. Ethan carried Lila up the steps and into the house. The main room was warm, the scent of stew still lingering from supper. A rough-hewn table sat in the middle, surrounded by mismatched chairs. To the left, a wide stone fireplace glowed with the last embers of the day's fire. He laid her carefully on the worn sofa, tucking a folded quilt under her head. She stirred faintly, murmuring something he couldn't quite make out. The sound of footsteps announced the arrival of his other children. 2 boys, Ben, age 11, and Sam, age 8, hovered in the doorway, peeking in with wide eyes. Behind them toddled little Emily, barely 4, her thumb in her mouth. "Is she hurt?" Ben asked. "She's been through a rough time," Ethan said, glancing at them. "Best you don't crowd her." Clara returned with a basin of water and a clean cloth. She handed them over, still watching Lila with that same wary expression. Ethan dipped the cloth, wrung it out, and gently pressed it to Lila's forehead. Her lips parted, and he lifted her head just enough to let her sip from a tin cup. She drank greedily at first, then slowed, her eyes opening a little wider. "You're safe now," he told her. "You're at my place." Her gaze moved around the room, taking in the faces, the walls, the firelight. She looked at Ethan again, as if trying to piece together how she'd gone from the blistering desert to this quiet lamplit home. I don't want to cause trouble," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Ethan shook his head. "Trouble's already past. You just rest." Clara's voice cut in, sharper than she intended. "Pa, who is she?" "Folks don't just show up buried in the sand for no reason." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "She's someone who needed help. That's all you need to know for now." The girl's eyes shifted to Clara, who met her gaze without flinching. Layla could see the suspicion there, the way the older girl's shoulders squared like she was ready to defend her family from an unknown threat. "I can sleep in the barn," Layla said suddenly, pushing herself up a little. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder to ease her back down. "You're too weak for that. You'll stay here until you're strong again." She opened her mouth to argue, but the exhaustion in her limbs won out. She sank back into the cushions, her eyes closing once more. Later that night, after the younger children were asleep, Clara found her father out by the corral, checking the latches. "Pa," she said quietly, "you don't even know her. What if someone comes looking?" Ethan met his daughter's eyes in the dim light. "Then we'll deal with it. But I won't turn someone out into the desert to die. Not while I'm breathing." Clara didn't reply right away. She wanted to argue, to remind him how hard things already were, how they barely kept up with the work as it was. But something in his voice made her hold her tongue. Inside, Lila lay half awake on the sofa, listening to the faint murmur of their voices outside. She knew he was right. Someone would come looking. And when they did, it might not be just trouble for her. It might be trouble for all of them. But for the first time in months, she felt something warm at the edges of her fear. Not safety, not yet, but the beginning of it. And that was enough to let her drift into sleep. The wind came in hard the next afternoon, rattling the porch boards and sending little whirlwinds of dust chasing across the yard. Ethan had been mending a fence post by the south pasture when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. Not the lazy drifting kind, but the sharp, steady rise of men on horseback. He knew right away they weren't riders just passing through Dot by the time they reached the edge of the ranch. Layla was in the barn, tending to the feed bins. She still moved slow, her body weak from what she'd been through, but she'd insisted on helping in any way she could. Clara was nearby, brushing Jasper, her eyes flicking toward the sound of hoofbeats. 4 men rode up, their horses stamping impatiently. They were dressed in trail-worn gear, dust in their beards, guns riding low on their hips. One of them, a broad man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, leaned forward in his saddle. "Cole," he called, his voice carrying over the wind. "We hear you got something belongs to us." Ethan rested his hands on the top rail of the corral, his posture calm, though his eyes stayed sharp. "Don't recall having anything of yours." The scarred man smirked. "Don't play dumb. We're talking about that girl. The Baron won the settlement voted to put down." Inside the barn, Leela froze. Every word cut through her like ice. Clara's hand stilled on the brush, her eyes darting toward the open barn door. "She's not yours to take," Ethan said flatly. The man's smirk faded. "She's cursed, Cole. You keep her here, you bring that curse on your land and your young ones. Town won't trade with you. You'll be cut off from every supply post this side of the river." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "My land's my business. And my young ones ain't yours to worry about." The rider beside the scarred man, younger, meaner looking, shifted in his saddle, his hand brushing the butt of his pistol. "We could just take her now and be done with it." From the barn came the sound of deliberate footsteps. Layla stepped into the sunlight, her chin lifted though her legs trembled. "If I leave now, you won't suffer for me," she said, her voice barely above the wind. Ethan turned his head toward her. "You're not leaving." "This ain't your fight," she whispered. "It is now," he replied. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Cole. We don't forget when someone crosses the settlement's will." Ethan stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the dust. "Then you remember this. You step foot on my land again to harm her, you'll ride back with one less man." A tense silence settled over the yard, the wind the only sound. The men exchanged glances, measuring the weight of his words. Finally, the scarred man spat into the dirt. "You'll regret this." He jerked his reins, turning his horse. The others followed, their hoofbeats fading toward the horizon, leaving the air heavy and still. Clara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Lila stood in the open yard, her hands knotted in her skirt, eyes fixed on the disappearing riders. Ethan walked toward her, his voice steady but quiet. "You don't run from a fight just because someone says you should. You're safe here, and I mean to keep it that way." She wanted to believe him. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. The settlement wasn't the kind to let go of grudges, and neither, it seemed, was Ethan Cole. The days after the standoff passed with a strange, tense quiet. The settlement hadn't returned, not yet, but their absence felt less like peace and more like the stillness before a summer storm. Ethan went about his work as usual, but Lila could see the way his eyes would drift toward the horizon every so often, scanning for a dust cloud that wasn't there yet. In that time, Lila began to settle into life on the ranch. She wasn't strong enough yet for heavy work, but she found ways to be useful. In the morning, she rose before the children, pulling on one of Clara's spare dresses and stepping into the kitchen to make biscuits and coffee. She mended torn shirts, sewed patches into worn trousers, and tidied the shelves that had gone. Untouched for months. At first, the children watched her like she was some strange animal brought in from the wild. Clara kept her distance. Ben hovered just close enough to ask questions. Sam followed her around with quiet curiosity, and little Emily would peek out from behind door frames, giggling when Lila caught her looking. One afternoon, Lila sat with Emily at the small table in the corner, a worn alphabet book between them. Emily's tiny fingers traced the letters as Lila guided her, her voice soft and patient. "That's an A," Lila said, smiling. "Like apple." Emily nodded, her tongue poking out in concentration. "Apple," she repeated, then looked up with a shy grin. From the doorway, Clara lingered, watching without a word. That night, when Ethan came in from the pasture, Clara spoke to him while he washed up at the basin. "She's teaching Emily her letters." He glanced at his daughter, gauging her tone. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Clara shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "I guess it's not." She paused, then added quietly, "She's not like I thought she'd be." Ethan didn't press further, but he noticed the next morning Clara sat down at the table and helped Layla knead bread dough without being asked. The shift was small, but it mattered. The first signs of trouble returning, it was a week later when the trouble came back. Ethan had gone into the pasture to check the north fence, leaving Lila with the children. The air was heavy that morning, the sky a dull silver with clouds that hadn't decided if they'd bring rain. The sound of hoofbeats came first, fast, purposeful, too many to belong to a passing neighbor. Layla's hands stilled on the wash. She'd been hanging, her stomach tightening. "Inside," she told the children quickly, her voice firm. Clara didn't argue, ushering the younger ones toward the house. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the yard, dismounting before the dust had even settled. They weren't the same men from before, but their faces carried the same brand of cruelty, the kind that thrived on the weakness of others. The tallest one stepped forward. "We ain't here to talk, girl. You're coming with us." Layla stood her ground, though her knees trembled. "I'm not going anywhere," he sneered. "You think that rancher can protect you forever? Men like him get tired of broken things." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'm not broken." The man's smirk widened. "Then why'd your husband leave you?" The words were meant to cut deep, and they did. But before she could answer, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed across the yard. The men froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Ethan stood by the corner of the barn, rifle aimed steady, his face a mask of cold steel. "You've got about 10 seconds to get off my land," he said. The men hesitated, weighing their chances. Then the tall one spat into the dirt. "This ain't over." They mounted up and rode off, the dust swallowing them as quickly as they'd come. Ethan lowered his rifle, but didn't look away from the horizon until they were gone. Then he turned to Lila. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her hand still shook. "They said it's not over." "It's over when I say it is," he replied. Bonds forged in defiance that night. After the children were asleep, Ethan found her sitting on the porch, staring out at the dark pasture. The lantern beside her cast a warm glow, softening the tension in her features. "They're right, you know," she said quietly. I've been nothing but trouble since I got here." Ethan leaned against the railing beside her. "You think? Trouble's what I see when I look at you?" She didn't answer, just stared down at her hands. "I see a woman who's been given every reason to quit and hasn't," he said. "My kids laugh more since you've been here. That's worth more than any curse some fool preacher talks about." The words caught her off guard. No one had ever spoken of her worth without adding conditions, without making it about what she could give in return. For the first time in a long while, Layla allowed herself to believe she might not be a burden. Shame she'd carried, the kind that clung like a second skin, began to loosen piece by piece. And with Ethan's quiet, unwavering defense, she started to think maybe her life wasn't over after all. The sun had barely begun its descent when the wind shifted over the valley, carrying the mingled scents of mesquite, wild sage, and the faintest trace of rain from far-off clouds. Caleb stood at the edge of the corral, one hand resting on the weathered post, watching the world he had rebuilt in the past months. His land, once silent, lonely, and haunted by emptiness, now breathed with life. The air rang with the chatter of 4 little voices playing somewhere near the barn, and their laughter was a melody that no amount of gold could match. Inside the ranch house, Elara moved quietly about the kitchen, the hem of her simple cotton dress swaying gently with each step. The woman he had once found buried in sand, her life fading away, now stood tall and radiant. The hollowness that had haunted her eyes was gone, replaced by a steady warmth that came from somewhere deep within. She had faced the cruelest judgment of her people, survived it, and found something worth living for, not in the form of revenge or running, but in the safety and belonging that this place and these people had offered her. Caleb stepped inside, boots tapping softly against the wooden floorboards. The scent of stew and freshly baked bread filled the air, and Elara glanced over her shoulder with a small smile, the kind of smile that carried a quiet trust. The kind she didn't give away easily. "You're back early," she said softly, placing the last loaf on the table. "Figured I'd rather be here than out there," he replied, motioning toward the open plains beyond the window. "Besides, the boys were missing their chores without me standing over them." She chuckled, a sound still rare but no longer foreign. "They've been working hard. You've taught them well." Caleb leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his gaze settling on her. "I didn't just teach them. You've had a hand in this too, Elara. You've kept this place running when I couldn't. You've kept us together." Her hand stilled over the bread knife, and for a moment she just stood there, feeling the weight of his words. "I've only done what needed to be done," she said after a pause. "That's the thing," Caleb said, stepping closer. "Most folks won't do what needs to be done unless it's easy. You've done it without asking for anything in return." Elara's eyes flickered up to meet his, a mixture of gratitude and caution in her gaze. She still wasn't used to being spoken to like she mattered, as though her worth wasn't measured by what she could give, but simply by who she was. Before either of them could say more, the front door banged open and the boys tumbled in, their boots muddy, hair windblown. The youngest, Samuel, carried a stray lamb in his arms, bleating softly. "Pa, look what we found by the creek," he exclaimed, nearly tripping over his own feet. Elara's maternal instinct took over instantly, moving to take the lamb and check its condition. "It's hungry," she said, examining the small creature. "I'll warm some milk." Caleb watched her, the easy way she cared for the animal mirroring the way she had cared for the boys, for the ranch, for him in small, unspoken ways. That night, after the boys had been put to bed and the lamps burned low, Caleb and Elara sat on the porch. The stars spread like spilled diamonds above them, and the crickets sang their endless chorus. "You ever think about what's next?" he asked quietly. Her eyes stayed on the dark horizon. I used to think I had no future. Now, she hesitated, as though afraid to speak the words out loud. Now I think maybe I do. But I don't know if it's mine to hope for. Caleb turned to her, his voice steady. You've got a home here, Alara. That was true the day I pulled you out of that sand, and it's truer now. Whatever future you want, you can build it here with us. Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't answer. Then she gave a small nod, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. It wasn't a declaration of love. Not yet, and it wasn't a promise sealed in words. But it was enough to know that they were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance, but two souls who had chosen to fight for the same life. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of rain, and somewhere deep inside, Alara felt the last remnants of the desert's cruelty wash away. She was no longer a woman buried in sand. She was alive, rooted, and for the first time free.